Hi everyone! Last time that we read the Parker Inheritance, we had just started reading about the secret tennis game that happened in 1957, and we had just heard about Jackie and Harold playing the first round, and Harold had made the first score, and everybody in the crowd was really on edge to find out what would happen next. So that's where I'm going to start up again. Harold was good enough to easily win the first two games, but Siobhan noticed how hard he was breathing. He was out of shape and was clearly tired by the middle of the third game. Her father must have noticed as well, because after a timeout, Jackie moved to the baseline and played a more defensive strategy. Instead of trying to hit winning shots like before, Jackie focused on just keeping the ball in play, forcing Harold to expend more energy chasing the ball around the court, which led to Harold becoming more tired and making more errors. Harold was barely even trying to move by the last game. Set 1 went to Jackie, 5-3. The boys met at the net. Jackie held out a hand, and after what seemed like an eternity, Harold gave it a half-hearted shake. Siobhan rubbed her bracelet for luck as Reggie warmed up with his teammate, Mordecai. A few feet away, Glenn Allen knocked around balls with another Wallace player. Glenn was wound pretty tightly, Siobhan thought. He was pounding the ball when he only needed to gently return it. His Wallace teammate had to duck once to avoid the tennis ball smashing against his jaw. Reggie looked loose, but his face was stern. He kept stealing glances at everyone. Glenn Allen, Siobhan, even Chip. Siobhan saw Chip flash Reggie a thumbs up the next time he glanced in the stands, but Reggie just snorted and went back to trading serves. She shook her head. Chip really didn't have a clue. "Keep your eyes open," Coach Hicks said to Mr. Smith as the boys returned to their seats. "It's about to get real interesting, with Glenn Allen taking the court." After a quick discussion with the coaches, Reverend Hollister motioned for Reggie and Glenn to greet each other before the game started. Neither of them moved. Likewise, neither coach made any attempt to tell his player to shake hands. Finally, the Reverend shook his head and pointed them to their positions. He threw the ball to Reggie for the first serve. Reggie bounced the ball a few times, called out the score, and fired the ball at Glenn so hard that the boy couldn't return it. 15-0, 30-0. 40-0. Game. Reggie looked at the stands toward Mary and Allen and smirked. After switching sides, Glenn served for the next game and started off just as strongly as Reggie, with 2 aces. But Reggie figured out how to return his serve on the next point, eventually bringing the score to 30 all. Then Reggie earned the lead on the next score, a devastating cross-court shot. He smirked again, this time at Chip. "He's way too cocky for his own good," Siobhan whispered. "Yeah, but look where he learned it from," Coach Hicks said, nodding toward her father. He had a grin on his face even larger than Reggie's. Dub jumped up and fist-pumped in the air after Reggie won the final point, giving him the second game. The boys switched sides again, but instead of crossing on opposite ends of the net like before, they crossed on the same side. Reggie whispered something as he passed Glenn. Glenn responded by ramming him with his elbow. Siobhan tensed up, ready to move. Reggie just laughed. Siobhan closed her eyes and offered up a prayer. She wanted Reggie to hurry and win the last 2 games. Then it would be over. The Perkins team would have proved that they could beat the best tennis team in the state, and everyone would go home safely. When she opened her eyes, she saw her father talking with Reggie. Reggie pulled back, and with a look of shock on his face. Then he smiled and nodded. On Reggie's first serve, he mistakenly double faulted, giving Glenn a 15-0 lead for the game. Siobhan didn't understand it. Reggie was the best server on the team. He never faulted, much less double faulted. On the next point, Reggie was slow to respond to a drop shot that had barely crossed the net, giving Glenn another score. This went on for a few more times, and suddenly, Glenn Allen had won his first game. Siobhan looked at her father, assuming that steam was about to shoot from the man's head. But Big Dub just sat there, slowly nodding, his hand on his chin. Siobhan realized what was going on. They were toying with Glenn, stretching out the match. They wanted to humiliate him. Glenn began Game 4 with a weak serve. Reggie responded with an even weaker return that bounced onto the net. But after letting Glenn run up the score 40-0 in Glenn's favor, Reggie came storming back, showing off his ferocious returns that he'd put aside for the first 2 games. He surged ahead, easily winning every remaining point. Siobhan took a deep breath. Reggie needed one more game. She watched as Reggie glanced at her father. Big Dub pressed his hands together, then slowly pulled them apart, and Reggie lost the next game through a mix of unforced errors and weak backhands. Siobhan was sure everyone could see the farce this exhibition had become. That is, except Marion Allen. He kept cheering, getting louder and louder as his brother pulled ahead, only to fall silent and sulk whenever Glenn began to lose. Finally, as Glenn prepared to serve for the sixth game, Siobhan saw her father run his hands across his neck in a slicing motion. Reggie grinned. Then his eyes narrowed, and he returned his attention to his opponent. Glenn served the ball. Reggie knocked it back so fast that Glenn could only watch as the ball bounced past him. As it became clear that Reggie planned to win this game, Coach Turner tried to argue a couple of the umpire's calls, but even he eventually stopped once the score became out of reach. Glenn glanced nervously at his brother. Then, right before what was sure to be the final serve, Glenn made a grand gesture of pulling a tennis ball from his pocket and placing it on the ground. He went to kick it out of the way, but instead he somehow stepped on it. Yelping, he dropped his racket and fell to the ground. "My ankle! I think I sprained it!" Siobhan rolled her eyes. Sure, it wasn't nice the way that Reggie had toyed with him, but this was just delaying the inevitable. Was it so insulting for Glenn to lose to a colored player that he would rather fake an injury? Coach Turner knelt in front of Glenn as Marion rushed over. They helped Glenn to his feet and led him to the bleachers. She was sure Glenn favored the wrong foot. "We need to reschedule the exhibition," Marion yelled. "You can't play on a bum ankle." "Yeah," another white man yelled. "Don't let the game end like this. It ain't fair." Siobhan watched her father and Adam Douglas saunter over Reverend Holland and Coach Turner in the center of the court. "Come on," Robert Hicks said, standing. "It's time for us to leave." Siobhan frowned. "But I promised Big Dub I'd get you out of here the minute things went bad," Coach Hicks said, "and that's exactly what's about to happen." "I'll follow you down," Mr. Smith said. "See if I can talk some sense into Dub." "Look, I didn't make up the rules here," Reverend Hollister was saying to Coach Turner once Siobhan, Coach Hicks, and Mr. Smith reached the bottom of the bleachers. "No substitutions." Coach Hicks kept walking past the court toward the exit, but Siobhan paused. Then she slowly inched along the bottom row, trailing behind Mr. Smith. She wanted to get closer so she could hear better. "Siobhan?" Coach Hicks hissed. "What are you doing?" Ignoring him, she took a seat. Reggie stood a few feet away, but he was too caught up in the conversation to notice her. "Either your player forfeits the set, or he gets back out there and finishes the game," Reverend Hollister continued. "That's final." "No, we need to reschedule," Coach Turner said. "And what, we forget the current score and start all over again?" Big Dub shook his head. "Come on, Coach. You're a man of integrity." "Well, you're a fine one to be talking about integrity with the stunt you just pulled." Coach Turner crossed his arms. "And I don't care what the rules are. I'm not about to let word get out that we lost to a bunch of colored boys." "Who exactly are you worried about?" Dub asked, his grin widening. "Marion Allen? Fine, I'll tell him." Adam Douglas grabbed Dub's arm. "Reverend Hollister is the one in charge here. Let's have him make the announcement." He turned to the Reverend. "Don't tell them we won. Say they lost because forfeit due to injury." "But that's a lie," Big Dub said. "A win's a win," Adam said. Siobhan looked up as Robert Hicks wrapped his hand around her arm. "You've heard enough." He pulled her to her feet. "Or do you want me to talk to your daddy about this?" Shaking her head, she glanced back at her father. He was talking with the team, the grin on his face wide and bright. She wanted to call up to Reggie to tell him goodbye, but decided against it. As Siobhan followed Coach Hicks from the court, he heard Reverend Hollister addressing a small crowd. A few people booed, the others cursed. Someone yelled, "Those colored boys cheated, didn't they?" Then she heard glass smashing against the ground. She whipped back around. Adam Douglas and Chip had corralled the Perkins team and was leading them away from the bleachers. A glass bottle had shattered a few feet away from them, but none of the boys seemed to be injured. Her father remained on the court, but Mr. Smith was doing his best to pull him away as well. "Let's go," Robert Hicks said, grabbing her arm again. This time he didn't release her until he placed her in the car. As she rubbed her arm, she searched the crowd, looking for Reggie. All she saw was a sea of white faces, and they were all angry. Chapter 32. On Saturday morning, after a quick game of basketball, Candace and Brandon biked to the library to search for as many books as they could about sports. It turned out there were a whole bunch of teams called the Oilers, so Brandon picked a book about the Negro Leagues, hockey, and football. They made a list of famous players from each of the teams, then added pi to each of the famous players' jersey numbers, but didn't know what to look for after that. In addition to Brandon's books, Candace chose a book about tennis and a biography of Althea Gibson, the African-American woman who won Wimbledon in 1957. Ellie had mentioned how Coach Washington had wanted Siobhan to be the next Althea Gibson. Maybe there was more to that connection. They returned home to see their mothers on Brandon's porch, drinking coffee. They dropped their bikes in the yard and walked up the steps. "About time," Brandon's mother said. "We've got to get a move on. Don't want to miss the African dance performance. It's the best part of the festival." "Sorry we're late," Brandon said. "You know, research." "I can't wait to see your project," his mother continued as she kissed him on the cheek. "Y'all sure haven't spent enough time on it." Brandon shrugged. "Yeah, Candace has been a big help." "And what about you, Mom? How was your morning?" Candace asked, trying to change the subject. "Pretty good," she said between sips of coffee. "I revised one chapter and added a new scene. Slow and steady wins the race. But enough about me. Tell me about this project." Not yet," Candace said. "You know, slow and steady wins the race. We'll tell you about it once we're finished." Then she smiled. "So, do we need to grab lunch before we head to the park?" "There'll be plenty of food there from local restaurants," her mom said. "I hope Sam's has a booth," Tori said, as she stepped onto the porch from the house. The Weston game was tucked underneath her arm. "I'm craving a chili cheese dog." "That sounds nice," her mother said. She smiled as she noticed the book. "Hey, I know that book," she said, reaching for it. "My mother loved this book." Candace could feel her eyes bugging out of her head. "She did?" Her mother nodded as she flipped it open. "Yeah, we have a copy at the house somewhere. She even tried to get you to read it when you were younger, but you didn't seem interested, and she didn't want to force it, I guess." Candace turned to Brandon. His mouth was hanging open. "So about those chili cheese dogs," her mother continued, handing the book back to Tori. "Do you know if they have a low-fat option, or maybe a vegetarian?" She trailed off as a large SUV pulled up in front of the Joneses' house. The windows were too tinted for them to see who was inside. "Trouble," Tori mumbled. "Hush," her mother said. She waved as Millie Stanford stepped out of the vehicle. Milo was dressed in a black basketball jersey. "We saw y'all and figured we'd stop and say hello," Miss Stanford said. "Okay, you said it," Tori whispered. "Now you can leave." Miss Jones smiled at Millie as she pinched her daughter's arm. "Enough," she whispered through her teeth. "I was hoping to see you at the game," Miss Stanford said to Candace as she reached the bottom step. "Milo scored 15 points. And 7 rebounds," Milo added. "Almost a double-double." Candace shrugged. "Oh, sorry. Guess I got the dates wrong." "It's so nice to finally meet you," Miss Stanford said to Candace's mother. "I'm Millie, and this is Milo. I met your daughter at church last week." She batted her eyelashes. "Maybe we'll see you there this Sunday." "Perhaps," her mother replied, shaking the woman's hand. Miss Stanford looked at their house across the street. "I was so sorry to hear about your mother's death. And if you don't mind me asking, how did she pass away?" "Heart disease," her mother said. "Ah, yes, it's one of those silent killers." She readjusted her sunglasses. "I thought that, and please don't take this the wrong way. Perhaps she had been suffering from dementia," she said. "You know, given everything that happened before, with the park and the tennis courts." "Trust me," her mother crossed her arms and stood taller. "It was a heart attack." And I'm going to stop right there. So, I'm wondering what you think about Glenn Allen faking an injury to get out of losing the game, even though they still technically lost because they forfeited due to an injury.